A thick-lipped man with rings, cool in white, bought scissors cigarettes from a platform vendor, 3 packs, to smoke in the train corridor. He was Esther's escort, a family friend who happened to be going to Madras, Mr. Kurian Mutton. Baba was buying Madras Calcutta. Amu was buying time. She too had to pack her things and leave, to start a new life in which she could afford to keep her children. Until then, it had been decided that one twin could stay in Yemenem, not both. Together they were trouble. They had to be separated. "Maybe they're right," Amu's whisper said as she packed his trunk and hold-all. "Maybe a boy does need a baba." It had been in the papers, the news of Sophie Mall's death, of the police encounter with a paravan charged with kidnapping and murder, of the subsequent Communist Party siege of Paradise Pickles and Preserves, led by Yemenem's own crusader for justice and spokesman of the oppressed. Comrade K.N.M. Pilla claimed that the management had implicated the paravan in a false police case because he was an active member of the Communist Party, that they wanted to eliminate him for indulging in lawful union activities. All that had been in the papers, the official version. Of course, the thick-lipped man with rings had no idea about the other version, the one in which a posse of touchable policemen crossed the Meenachal River, sluggish and swollen with recent rain, and picked their way through the wet undergrowth, clumping into the heart of darkness. Their wide khaki shorts were rigid with starch and bobbed over the tall grass like a row of stiff skirts, quite independent of the limbs that moved inside them. There were 6 of them, servants of the state, the Kottayam police, New Age princes in funny pointed helmets, dark of heart, deadly purposed. They lifted their thin legs high, clumping through tall grass. Brown millipedes slept in the soles of their steel-tipped, touchable boots. The early morning heat was full of the promise of worse to come. A forked canal, still, a tree trunk fallen over it. The touchable policeman minced across. Then the sunlight was fractured by thin trunks of tilting trees. Dark of heartness tiptoed into the heart of darkness. Acres of this, and then a grassy clearing, a house, the History House, whose doors were locked and windows open, where an old Englishman ghost, sickled to a tree, was abrogated by a pair of 2-egg twins, a mobile republic with a puff, who had planted a Marxist flag in the earth beside him. As the platoon of policemen minced past, they didn't hear him beg, in his kind missionary voice, "Excuse me, would you wouldn't happen to... I don't suppose you'd have a cigar on you? No? No, I didn't think so." The History House, where in the years that followed, the terror, still to come, would be buried in a shallow grave, hidden under the happy humming of hotel cooks, the humbling of old communists, the slow death of dancers, the toy histories that rich tourists came to play with. It was a beautiful house. The policemen stopped and fanned out. They didn't really need to, but they liked these touchable games. They positioned themselves strategically. Together, on their knees and elbows, they crept towards the house, like film policemen, softly, softly through the grass, batons in their hands, machine guns in their minds, responsibility for the touchable future on their thin but able shoulders. They found their quarry in the back veranda, a spoiled puff, a fountain in a love in Tokyo, and in another corner, as lonely as a wolf, a carpenter with blood-red nails, asleep, making nonsense of all that touchable cunning, the surprise swoop, the headlines in their heads. Desperado caught in police dragnet. For this insolence, this spoiling the fun, their quarry paid. Oh, yes. They woke Veluta with their boots. Esteban and Rahel woke to the shout of sleep, surprised by shattered kneecaps. Screams died in them and floated belly up like dead fish. Cowering on the floor, rocking between dread and disbelief, they realized that the man being beaten was Veluta. Where had he come from? What had he done? Why had the policeman brought him here? They heard the thud of wood on flesh, boot on bone, on teeth, the muffled grunt when a stomach is kicked in, the muted crunch of skull on cement, the gurgle of blood on a man's breath when his lung is torn by the jagged end of a broken rib. Blue-lipped and dinner-plate-eyed, they watched, mesmerized by something that they sensed but didn't understand, the absence of caprice in what the policeman did, the abyss where anger should have been, the sober, steady brutality, the economy of it all. Cracking an egg to make an omelette. The twins were too young to know that these were only history's henchmen, sent to square the books and collect the dues from those who broke its laws. Impelled by feelings that were primal, yet paradoxically wholly impersonal, feelings of contempt born of inchoate, unacknowledged fear, civilization's fear of nature, men's fear of women, power's fear of powerlessness, man's subliminal urge to destroy what he could neither subdue nor deify, men's needs. What Esteban and Rahel witnessed that morning, though they didn't know it then, was a clinical demonstration in controlled conditions. This was not war, after all, or genocide, of human nature's pursuit of ascendancy. Structure, order, complete monopoly. It was human history, masquerading as God's purpose, revealing herself to an underage audience. History in live performance. If they hurt Veluta more than they intended to, it was only because any kinship, any connection between themselves and him, any implication that if nothing else, at least biologically, he was a fellow creature, had been severed long ago. They were not arresting a man, they were exercising fear. Unlike the custom of rampaging religious mobs or conquering armies running riot, that morning in the heart of darkness, the posse of touchable policemen acted with economy, not frenzy, efficiency, not anarchy. After all, they were not battling an epidemic. They were merely inoculating a community against an outbreak. In the back veranda of the History House, as the man they loved was smashed and broken, Mrs. Ipen and Mrs. Rajagopalan, twin ambassadors of God knows what, learned 2 new lessons. Lesson number 1. Blood barely shows on a black man, dum-dum. And lesson number 2. It smells, though, sick sweet, like old roses on a breeze, dum-dum. Madio, one of history's agents asked. Madi ayirikum, another replied. Enough? Enough. They stepped away from him, craftsmen assessing their work, seeking aesthetic distance. Their work, abandoned by God and history, by Marx, by man, by woman, and, in the hours to come, by children, lay folded on the floor. He was semi-conscious, but wasn't moving. His skull was fractured in 3 places. His nose and both his cheekbones were smashed, leaving his face pulpy, undefined. The blow to his mouth had split open his upper lip and broken 6 teeth, 3 of which were embedded in his lower lip, hideously inverting his beautiful smile. 4 of his ribs were splintered. 1 had pierced his left lung, which was what made him bleed from his mouth. His lower intestine was ruptured and hemorrhaged. The blood collected in his abdominal cavity. His spine was damaged in 2 places. The concussion had paralyzed his right arm and resulted in a loss of control over his bladder and rectum. Both his kneecaps were shattered. Still, they brought out the handcuffs, cold, with the sour metal smell, like steel bus rails and the bus conductor's hands from holding them. That was when they noticed his painted nails. 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 That was when they noticed his painful click and click. Below a lucky leaf, an autumn leaf at night that made the monsoons come on time. He had goosebumps where the handcuffs touched his skin. "It isn't him," Rahel whispered to Esther. "I can tell. It's his twin brother, Urumban, from Kochi." Unwilling to seek refuge in fiction, Esther said nothing. Someone was speaking to them, a kind, touchable policeman, kind to his kind. "Mon? Mol, are you all right? Did he hurt you?" And not together, but almost, the twins replied in a whisper, "Yes, no." "Don't worry, you're safe with us now." Then the policeman looked around and saw the grass mat, the pots and pans, the inflatable goose, the Qantas koala with loosened button eyes, the ballpoint pens with London streets in them, socks with separate colored toes, yellow-rimmed red plastic sunglasses, a watch with the time painted on it. "Whose are these? Where did they come from? Who brought them?" An edge of worry in the voice. Esther and Rahel, full of fish, stared back at him. The policemen looked at one another. They knew what they had to do. The Qantas koala they took for their children, and the pens and socks, police children with multicolored toes. They burst the goose with a cigarette, bang, and buried the rubber scraps. The watch they all forgot. It stayed behind in the history house, in the back veranda. A faulty record of the time, 10 to 2. They left. 6 princes, their pockets stuffed with toys, a pair of 2-egg twins, and the god of loss. He couldn't walk, so they dragged him. Nobody saw them. At the police station, Inspector Thomas Matthew sent for 2 Coca-Colas. A servile constable brought them on a plastic tray and offered them to the 2 muddy children sitting across the table from the inspector, their heads only a little higher than the mess of files and papers on it. So once again, in the space of 2 weeks, bottled fear for Esther. Chilled, fizzed. Sometimes things went worse with Coke. The fizz went up his nose. He burped. Rahel giggled. She blew through her straw till the drink bubbled over onto her dress, all over the floor. To his credit, Inspector Thomas Matthew remained calm. He sensed the growing incoherence in the children. He noted the dilated pupils. He had seen it all before. The human mind's escape valve, its way of managing trauma. He made allowances for that and couched his questions cleverly, innocuously. "Between when is your birthday, Mon? And what's your favorite color, Mol?" Gradually, in a fractured, disjointed fashion, things began to fall into place. His men had briefed him about the pots and pans, the grass mat, the impossible-to-forget toys. They began to make sense now. Inspector Thomas Matthew was not amused. He sent a jeep for baby Kochima. He made sure the children were not in the room when she arrived. He didn't greet her. "Have a seat," he said. Baby Kochima sensed that something was terribly wrong. "Have you found them? Is everything all right?" "Nothing is all right," the inspector assured her. From the look in his eyes and the tone of his voice, baby Kochima realized that she was dealing with a different person this time. Inspector Thomas Matthew didn't mince his words. The Kottayam police had acted on the basis of an FIR filed by her. The Paravan had been caught. Unfortunately, he had been badly injured in the encounter, and in all likelihood would not live through the night. But now the children said that they had gone of their own volition. Their boat had capsized, and the English child had drowned by accident, which left the police saddled with the death in custody of a technically innocent man. True, he was a paravan. True, he had misbehaved. But these were troubled times, and technically, as per the law, he was an innocent man. There was no case. "Attempted rape?" Baby Kochima suggested weakly. "Where is the rape victim's complaint? Has it been filed? Has she made a statement? Have you brought it with you?" The inspector's tone was belligerent, almost hostile. Baby Kochima looked as though she had shrunk. "The matter is very simple. Either the rape victim must file a complaint, or the children must identify the paravan as their abductor in the presence of a police witness. Or," he waited for Baby Kochima to look at him, "or I must charge you with lodging a false FIR. Criminal offense." Sweat stained Baby Kochima's light blue blouse dark blue. Inspector Thomas Matthew didn't hustle her. He knew that given the political climate, he himself could be in very serious trouble. He was aware that Comrade K.N.M. Pilla would not pass up this opportunity. He kicked himself for acting so impulsively. "The children will do as they're told," Baby Kochima said. "If I could have a few moments alone with them." "As you wish." The inspector rose to leave the office. "Please give me 5 minutes before you send them in." Inspector Thomas Matthew nodded his assent and left. Baby Kochima, wiping her shining, sweaty face, she kissed her crucifix. "Hail Mary, full of grace." The words of the prayer deserted her. The door opened. Esther and Rahel were ushered in, caked with mud, drenched in Coca-Cola. The sight of Baby Kochima made them suddenly sober. The moth, with unusually dense dorsal tufts, spread its wings over both their hearts. Baby Kochima looked at them sternly. She said nothing for a long time. When she spoke, her voice was hoarse and unfamiliar. "Your lovely little cousin's body is lying in the drawing-room. The fish have eaten out her eyes. Her mother can't stop crying." A sudden breeze made the flowered window curtain billow. Outside, Rahel could see jeeps parked and walking people. Inside the inspector's room, Papaji's moth was on the move. "It's a terrible thing to take a person's life," Baby Kochima said. "It's the worst thing that anyone can ever do. Even God doesn't forgive that. You know that, don't you?" Two heads nodded twice. "And yet," she looked sadly at them, "you did it." She looked them in the eye. "You are murderers." She waited for this to sink in. "You know that I know that it wasn't an accident. I know how jealous of her you were, and if the judge asks me in court, I'll have to tell him, won't I? I can't tell a lie, can I?" She patted the chair next to her. "Here, come and sit down." 4 cheeks of 2 obedient bottoms squeezed into it. "I'll have to tell them how it was strictly against the rules for you to go alone to the river, how you forced her to go with you, although you knew she couldn't swim. It wasn't an accident, was it?" 4 saucers stared back at her, fascinated by the story she was telling them. Then what happened? "So now you'll have to go to jail," Baby Kochima said kindly. "And your mother will go to jail because of you. Would you like that?" Frightened eyes and a fountain looked back at her. 3 of you in 3 different jails. Do you know what jails in India are like? 2 heads shook twice. Baby Kochima built up her case. She drew, from her imagination, vivid pictures of prison life. When she had stamped out every ray of hope, destroyed their lives completely, like a fairy godmother, she presented them with a solution. God would never forgive them for what they had done, but here on earth there was a way of undoing some of the damage, of saving their mother from humiliation and suffering on their account, provided they were prepared to be practical. "Luckily," Baby Kochima said, "luckily for you, the police have made a mistake. A lucky mistake." She paused. "You know what it is, don't you?" "The thing is," Baby Kochima's voice was saying, "what's done is done. The inspector says he's going to die anyway, so it won't really matter to him what the police think. What matters is whether you want to go to jail and make Amu go to jail because of you. It's up to you to decide that. If you want to save her, all you have to do is go with the uncle with the big Mishas. He'll ask you a question. One question. All you have to do is say, yes. Then we can all go home. It's so easy. It's a small price to pay. So, she said with a bright, brittle smile, the strain beginning to tell in her voice, what shall I tell the inspector, uncle? What have we decided? Do you want to save Amu, or shall we send her to jail? As though she were offering them a choice of two treats, fishing or bathing the pigs. Bathing the pigs or fishing? The twins looked up at her, not together, but almost. Two frightened voices whispered, "Save Amu." In the years to come, they would replay this scene in their heads, as children, as teenagers, as adults. Had they been deceived into doing what they did? Had they been tricked into condemnation? In a way, yes. But it wasn't as simple as that. They both knew that they had been given a choice. And how quick they had been in the choosing. They hadn't given it more than a second of thought before they looked up and said, not together, but almost, "Save Amu. Save us. Save our mother." Baby Kochima beamed. Relief worked like a laxative. She needed to go to the bathroom, urgently. She opened the door and asked for the inspector. "They're good little children," she told him when he came. "They'll go with you." "No need for both. One will serve the purpose," Inspector Thomas Matthew said. "Esther," Baby Kochima chose. "Little man, he lived in a caravan, dum-dum." Esther went. Ambassador E. Pelvis, with saucer eyes and a spoiled puff, a short ambassador flanked by tall policemen, on a terrible mission deep into the bowels of the Kottayam police station. Rahel remained behind in the inspector's office and listened to the rude sounds of Baby Kochima's relief dribbling down the sides of the inspector's pot in his attached toilet. The lockup was pitch dark. Esther could see nothing, but he could hear the sound of rasping, labored breathing. Someone switched on the light. Bright, blinding. Veluta appeared on the scummy, slippery floor, a mangled genie invoked by a modern lamp. He was naked, his soiled mundu had come undone. Blood spilled from his skull like a secret. His face was swollen, and his head looked like a pumpkin, too large and heavy for the slender stem it grew from, a pumpkin with a monstrous upside-down smile. Police boots stepped back from the rim of a pool of urine, spreading from him, the bright, bare, electric bulb reflected in it. Dead fish floated up in Esther. One of the policemen prodded Veluta with his foot. There was no response. Inspector Thomas Matthews squatted on his haunches and raked his jeep key across the sole of Veluta's foot. Swollen eyes opened, wandered, then focused through a film of blood on a beloved child. Esther imagined that something in him smiled. Not his mouth, but some other unhurt part of him. His elbow, perhaps, or shoulder. The inspector asked his question. Esther's mouth said yes. Childhood tiptoed out. Silence slid in like a bolt. Someone switched off the light, and Veluta disappeared. On their way back in the police jeep, Baby Kochima stopped at Reliable Medicos for some compos. She gave them 2 each. By the time they reached Tungam Bridge, their eyes were beginning to close. Esther whispered something into Rahel's ear. "You were right. It wasn't him. It was Rumban." "Thank God," Rahel whispered back. "Where do you think he is?" "Escaped to Africa." They were handed over to their mother, fast asleep, floating on this fiction, until the next morning when Amu shook it out of them. But by then it was too late. Inspector Thomas Matthew, a man of experience in these matters, was right. Veluta didn't live through the night. Half an hour past midnight, death came for him. And for the little family curled up and asleep on a blue cross-stitch counterpane, what came for them? Not death, just the end of living. After Sophie Mall's funeral, when Amu took them back to the police station and the inspector chose his mangoes, tap, tap, the body had already been removed. Dumped in the Tumadi Kudi, the pauper's pit, where the police routinely dumped their dead. When baby Kochima heard about Amu's visit to the police station, she was terrified. She had gambled on the fact that Amu, whatever else she did, however angry she was, would never publicly admit to her relationship with Veluta. Because, according to baby Kochima, that would amount to destroying herself and her children, forever. But baby Kochima hadn't taken into account the unsafe edge in Amu, the unmixable mix, the infinite tenderness of motherhood, the reckless rage of a suicide bomber. Baby Kochima knew she had to get Amu out of Yemenem as soon as possible. She managed that by doing what she was best at, irrigating her fields, nourishing her crops with other people's passions. She gnawed like a rat into the go-down of Chaco's grief. Within its walls, she planted an easy, accessible target for his insane anger. It wasn't hard for her to portray Amu as the person actually responsible for Sophie Mall's death, Amu and her 2 egg twins. Chaco, breaking down doors, was only the sad bull thrashing at the end of baby Kochima's leash. It was her idea that Amu be made to pack her bags and leave, that Esta be returned. And so, at the Cochin Harbor terminus, Esta alone at the barred train window, Ambassador E. Pelvis, a millstone with a puff, and a green wavy, thick watery, lumpy, seaweedy, floaty, bottomless, bottomful feeling. His trunk with his name on it was under his seat, his tiffin box with tomato sandwiches on the little folding table in front of him. Through the window bars, Amu held his hand. "Keep your ticket carefully," Amu's mouth said. Amu's trying not to cry mouth. "They'll come and check." Esther nodded down at Amu's face, tilted up to the train window. At Rahel, small and smudged with station dirt, all 3 of them bonded by the certain separate knowledge that they had loved a man to death. That wasn't in the papers. It took the twins years to understand Amu's part in what had happened. At Sophie Mall's funeral and in the days before Esta was returned, they saw her swollen eyes, and with the self-centeredness of children, held themselves wholly culpable for her grief. "Eat the sandwiches before they get soggy," Amu said, "and don't forget to write." She scanned the fingernails of the little hand she held, and slid a black sickle of dirt from under the thumbnail. "And look after my sweetheart for me, until I come and get him." "When, Amu? When will you come for him?" "Soon." "Month after next, Amu?" Deliberately making it a long time away, so that Amu would say, "Before that, Esta, be practical. What about your studies?" "As soon as I get a job. As soon as I can go away from here and get a job," Amu said. "But that will be never!" A wave of panic, a bottomless, bottomful feeling. By never, Esta had only meant that it would be too far away, that it wouldn't be now, wouldn't be soon. By never, he hadn't meant not ever. But that's how the words came out. "But that will be never." For never, they just took the O and the T out of not ever. They? The government, where people were sent to jolly well behave. And that's how it all turned out. Never, not ever. It was his fault that the faraway man in Amu's chest stopped shouting. His fault that she died alone in the lodge with no one to lie at the back of her and talk to her, because he was the one that had said it. "But Amu, that will be never." "Don't be silly, Esta. It'll be soon," Amu's mouth said. "I'll be a teacher, I'll start a school, and you and Rahel will be in it." And in our school we'll have classrooms and blackboards, Esther said. And chalk. And real teachers teaching. And proper punishments, Rahel said. This was the stuff their dreams were made of, on the day that Esther was returned. Chalk, blackboards, proper punishments. They didn't ask to be let off lightly. They only asked for punishments that fitted their crimes, not ones that came like cupboards with built-in bedrooms, not ones you spent your whole life in, wandering through its maze of shelves. Without warning, the train began to move, very slowly. Esther's pupils dilated. His nails dug into Amu's hand as she walked along the platform, her walk turning into a run as the Madras mail picked up speed. God bless my baby, my sweetheart, I'll come for you soon. Amu, Esther said as she disengaged her hand, prizing loose small finger after finger. Amu, feeling vomity. Esther's voice lifted into a wail. Little Elvis the pelvis with a spoiled special outing puff and beige and pointy shoes, he left his voice behind. On the station platform, Rahel doubled over and screamed and screamed. 23 years later, Rahel, dark woman in a yellow t-shirt, turns to Esther in the dark. Esther papi chachen kutapen Peterman, she says. She whispers. She moves her mouth. Their beautiful mother's mouth. Esther, sitting very straight, waiting to be arrested, takes his fingers to it, to touch the words it makes, to keep the whisper. His fingers follow the shape of it. The touch of teeth. His hand is held and kissed, pressed against the coldness of a cheek, wet with shattered rain. Then she sat up and put her arms around him, drew him down beside her. They lay like that for a long time, awake in the dark, quietness and emptiness, not old, not young, but of viable, dieable age. They were strangers who had met in a chance encounter. They had known each other before life began. There is very little that anyone could say to clarify what happened next. Nothing that in Mamachi's book would separate sex from love, or needs from feelings, except perhaps that no watcher watched through Rahel's eyes. No one stared out of a window at the sea, or a boat in the river, or a passer-by in the mist in a hat, except perhaps that it was a little cold, a little wet, but very quiet, the air. But what was there to say? Only that there were tears. Only that quietness and emptiness fitted together like stacked spoons. Only that there was a snuffling in the hollows at the base of a lovely throat. Only that a hard honey-color shoulder had a semicircle of teeth marks on it. Only that they held each other close, long after it was over. Only that what they shared that night was not happiness, but hideous grief. Only that once again they broke the love laws, that laid down who should be loved, and how much. On the roof of the abandoned factory, the lonely drummer drummed. A gauze door slammed. A mouse rushed across the factory floor. Cobwebs sealed old pickle vats, empty all but one, in which a small heap of congealed white dust lay, bone dust from a barn owl. Long dead, pickle dowel. In answer to Sophie Moll's question, Chaco, where do old birds go to die? Why don't dead ones fall like stones from the sky? Asked on the evening of the day she arrived. She was standing on the edge of baby Kochima's ornamental pond, looking up at the kites wheeling in the sky. Sophie Moll, hatted, bell-bottomed, and loved from the beginning. Then it was time for dinner. "Supper, silly," Sophie Moll said when Esther was sent to call her. At supper, silly, the children sat at a separate smaller table. Sophie Moll with her back to the grown-ups, made gruesome faces at the food. When Rahel did the same, Amu saw her and took her to bed. Her good-night kiss left no spit on Rahel's cheek, and Rahel could tell that she wasn't really angry. "You're not angry, Amu," in a happy whisper. A little more her mother loved her. "No." Amu kissed her again. And as Amu walked away, she heard her daughter whisper, "Amu, we be of one blood, thou and I." Amu leaned against the bedroom door in the dark, reluctant to return to the dinner table, where the conversation circled like a moth round the white child and her mother, as though they were the only source of light. As she leaned against the door in the darkness, she felt her dream, her afternoon mare, move inside her like a rib of water, rising from the ocean, gathering into a wave. The cheerful one-armed man with salty skin and a shoulder that ended abruptly like a cliff emerged from the shadows of the jagged beach and walked towards her. Who was he? Who could he have been? The god of loss, the god of small things, the god of goosebumps and sudden smiles. He could only do one thing at a time. If he touched her, he couldn't talk to her. If he loved her, he couldn't leave. If he spoke, he couldn't listen. If he fought, he couldn't win. Amu longed for him, ached for him with the whole of her biology. She returned to the dinner table. When the old house had closed its bleary eyes and settled into sleep, Amu, wearing one of Chaco's old shirts over a long white petticoat, walked out onto the front veranda. Amu drew her knees up and hugged them. She stared fiercely out at the garden. Usa the barn owl flew past on a silent nocturnal patrol. She remained sitting for a while, long after the song had ended. Then suddenly she rose from her chair and walked out of her world like a witch, to a better, happier place. She moved quickly through the darkness like an insect following a chemical trail. She knew the path to the river as well as her children did, and could have found her way there blindfolded. She didn't know what it was that made her hurry through the undergrowth, that turned her walk into a run, as though she knew he would be there, waiting, as though he knew she would come. He did know. That knowledge had slid into him that afternoon, cleanly, like the sharp edge of a knife, when history had slipped up. He wasn't there. Amu sat on the stone steps that led to the water. She buried her head in her arms, feeling foolish for having been so sure, so certain. Farther downstream in the middle of the river, Veluta floated on his back, looking up at the stars. He flipped over and began to swim, upstream, against the current. He turned towards the bank for one last look, treading water, feeling foolish for having been so sure, so certain. When he saw her, it took all his strength to stay afloat. She didn't see the knob of his head bobbing over the dark river. He could have been anything. In any case, she wasn't looking. Her head was buried in her arms. He watched her. He took his time. Had he known that he was about to enter a tunnel whose only egress was his own annihilation, would he have turned away? Perhaps. Perhaps not. Who can tell? He began to swim towards her. He had almost reached the bank when she looked up and saw him. His feet touched the muddy riverbed. As he rose from the dark river and walked up the stone steps, she saw that the world they stood in was his, that he belonged to it, that it belonged to him. As she watched him, she understood the quality of his beauty, how his labor had shaped him, how the wood he fashioned had fashioned him, had given him his strength, his supple grace. He wore a thin white cloth around his loins, looped between his dark legs. She could see his smile in the dark, his white, sudden smile that he carried with him from boyhood into manhood, his only luggage. They looked at each other. They weren't thinking anymore. The time for that had come and gone. Smashed smiles lay ahead of them, but that would be later. Later. He stood before her with the river dripping from him. She stayed sitting on the steps watching him, her face pale in the moonlight. A sudden chill crept over him. Amukuti, what is it? She went to him and laid the length of her body against his. He just stood there. He didn't touch her. He was shivering, partly with cold, partly terror, partly aching desire. His wetness wet her. She put her arms around him. He tried to be rational. What's the worst thing that can happen? I could lose everything. My job, my family, my livelihood. Everything. She could hear the wild hammering of his heart. She held him till it calmed down, somewhat. She unbuttoned her shirt. They stood there, skin to skin, her brownness against his blackness, her softness against his hardness, her nut-brown breasts that wouldn't support a toothbrush against his smooth ebony chest. She smelled the river on him, his particular paravan smell that so disgusted baby Kochima. She pulled his head down toward her and kissed his mouth, a cloudy kiss, a kiss that demanded a kiss back. He kissed her back, first cautiously, then urgently. He was careful not to hurt her. She could feel how soft she felt to him, the way her body existed only where he touched her. The rest of her was smoke. She felt him shudder against her. His hands were on her haunches that could support a whole array of toothbrushes, pulling her hips against his to let her know how much he wanted her. They lay under the mangosteen tree where only recently a gray old boat plant with boat flowers and boat fruit had been uprooted by a mobile republic, a wasp, a flag, a surprised puff, a fountain in a love in Tokyo. Leaving a boat-shaped patch of bare, dry earth cleared and ready for love, as though Esteban and Rahel had prepared the ground for them, willed this to happen. The twin midwives of Amu's dream. Amu, naked now, crouched over Veluta, her mouth on his. He drew her hair around them like a tent, like her children did when they wanted to exclude the outside world. At the moment she guided him into her, she caught a passing glimpse of his youth, his youngness, the wonder in his eyes at the secret he had unearthed, and she smiled down at him as though he was her child. Once he was inside her, fear was derailed and biology took over. The cost of living climbed to unaffordable heights. 2 lives, 2 children's childhoods, and a history lesson for future offenders. He held her against him, resting his back against the mangosteen tree, while she cried and laughed at once. Then, for what seemed like an eternity, but was really no more than 5 minutes, she slept, leaning against him, her back against his chest. 7 years of oblivion lifted off her and flew into the shadows on weighty, quaking wings. And on Amu's road to age and death, a small sunny meadow appeared. Beyond it, an abyss. Slowly, the terror seeped back into him, at what he had done, at what he knew he would do again, and again. She woke to the sound of his heart knocking against his chest, as though it was searching for a way out, for that movable rib. He folded his fear into a perfect rose. He held it out in the palm of his hand. She took it from him and put it in her hair. She moved closer, wanting to be within him, to touch more of him. It was a little cold, a little wet, a little quiet, the air. But what was there to say? Only one thing mattered now. They knew that it was all they could ask of each other, the only thing, ever. They both knew that. Even later, on the 13 nights that followed this one, Instinctively they stuck to the small things. The big things ever lurked inside. They knew that there was nowhere for them to go. They had nothing, no future, so they stuck to the small things. Each time they parted, they extracted only one small promise from each other. Tomorrow? Tomorrow. They knew that things could change in a day. They were right about that. That first night, on the day that Sophie Mole came, Veluta watched his lover dress. When she was ready, she squatted facing him. She touched him lightly with her fingers and left a trail of goosebumps on his skin. He took her face in his hands and drew it towards his. He closed his eyes and smelled her skin. Amu laughed. Yes, Margaret, she thought, we do it to each other too. She kissed his closed eyes and stood up. Veluta, with his back against the mangosteen tree, watched her walk away. She had a dry rose in her hair. She turned to say it once again. Nale. Tomorrow.
We hope you've enjoyed this program from Harper Audio. To order additional cassettes or to receive a complete catalog of Harper Audio and Cadman titles, please call us at 1-800-331-3761. That's 1-800-331-3761. Thank you.